So today we're going to be talking about the Ubaid period of Greater Mesopotamia, and I want to apologize in advance. This is where my dissertation research has been focused, and so my interest here is one beyond just kind of casual understanding. And so this lecture is probably a bit too detailed for this level of class, but there's so much stuff I couldn't cut out because I think it's all really cool. So we're going to focus today on first southern Mesopotamia and the origins of the Ubaid, and then its expansion northward. So when we're talking about the Ubaid, we're talking about the first permanent occupation of the lower Euphrates and Tigris River valleys. And I say this in the slide here as earliest known, and it's possible that we're looking at earlier occupations, but from the millennia of buildup of sedimentation here in the Tigris and Euphrates deltas, we may be just not able to find them. So what we're seeing here is the Euphrates, the Tigris, and the host of Ubaid sites here in the southern alluvium that would later become known as Sumer. And the Ubaid tradition has traditionally been viewed as kind of this linchpin of socio-political development because it's the 2,000 years leading up to the development of the first Uruk state in Mesopotamia. So a lot of scholars have kind of viewed the Ubaid as kind of setting the stage for the Uruk, and we'll talk about why that is viewed that way in some context. Uh, so what we see is about 6500 BCE at a site like Oweli. We see earliest occupations at small agricultural villages that then later expand into larger, more centralized towns like Eridu, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the Ubaid tradition itself is kind of remarkable in its similarity. Its material culture, including painted ceramics, tripartite architecture, the material artifacts like clay sickles and bent muellers, and these Ophidian reptile-style figurines, are found all throughout the southern alluvium. And beginning by about 5000 BCE, those styles first spread southward into the Persian Gulf, as far south as the Strait of Hormuz, but then later into central Iraq. And by about 5000 BCE, we can find Ubaid-related occupations and material traditions covering most of the modern Middle East, from Iran, central Iranian highlands in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, and as far north as the Caucasus Mountains in modern Azerbaijan and Armenia. So we're looking at what is quite possibly the largest area of influence in the Middle East until the subsequent Neo-Assyrian Empire, sometime about 4,000 years later. So this is one of these periods that's really kind of fascinating to look at the spread of and the connections of these vastly different and disparate communities. Now, traditionally, archaeologists had assumed that Ubaid society was at its foundation built around intensive irrigated agriculture. And that's because it's in the lower southern Mesopotamian alluvium in modern Iraq today, where it's in the middle of the massive desert here outside of the confines of the river valleys themselves. And so to grow agricultural production, that is wheat and barley, you would have had to had well-maintained irrigation canals, gravity-fed systems that would have provided water for the crops, for the people, and to supplement the pig, cattle, and to a lesser extent sheep and goat husbandry. And that's because sheep and goat just don't do as well in the kind of wet environments that these irrigated systems would have provided. And there's not enough fodder outside of that, outside in the desert regions. However, recent research has really kind of set this on its head. And in particular, Jennifer Purnell's research on early Ubaid societies, and she suggested that they were largely dependent on littoral resources in the Euphrates and Tigris Delta. Her argument is that all of these sites are built on small natural levees, what she calls turtlebacks, rather than open areas within the delta marshes. And so basically what we see is that around 6000 BCE, the environment was much wetter, the marshes extended much further north, and that's because the Persian Gulf itself extended further north. Sites like Eridu and Ur were likely on the shores of the Persian Gulf. So we had these kinds of reliance on marine resources. And when we look at the faunal remains from sites like Tel Oweli and Eridu, where we had these early occupations, they are largely dominated by fish bones and mussels, shellfish, within this. So we see here rather than kind of building on irrigated agriculture, it's the natural environment that's providing the impetus, providing the reason for these people to stay in one place. This is also supported when we look at the artifacts themselves. We see ground stone and baked clay fishnet weights that are added to the broader assemblage, like the clay sickles that you see here. And we also find ceramic boat models at sites like Al Ubaid and Eridu, but also further north in Syria on the upper Euphrates or middle Euphrates, we see at Tel Mashnaka a similar type of boat model. And this suggests that the movement of people and goods through the marshes and up the rivers and into the Persian Gulf was an important part of the spread of this Ubaid system. Now, as Scott has kind of argued, what we see is that the cereal crops and the animal domesticates were used to supplement that natural marshland environment. And Scott and Pornell both argue that the type of agriculture that they would have practiced is not one that required large scale intensive irrigation, but rather was flood recession agriculture. That is, that they would plant the seeds as the floodwater started to recede, and the rivers itself would provide the irrigation in the marshlands, and then they would go ahead and harvest these naturally irrigated crops. It's not until later in the Uruk period that we see the extensive construction of these large-scale irrigation canals that typify the traditional understanding of Ubaid society. Now we also see the utilization of flax for linen and possibly also for oil, and the domestication of the date palm. So we have a relatively broad and varied domesticate suite here that's supplementing those extensively utilized and resource-rich fisheries of the Nile Delta and the Persian Gulf.